All right, listeners, get ready for a deep dive. We got a fascinating chapter here from Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise, all about the FTC and, antitrust law,
Mhm.
and basically how big companies, play by the rules, what happens when they don't. We're going to be looking at like how free are you really to choose, what you buy, where you get your news,
Right.
even how your kids experience the internet. So much to unpack here.
Yeah, and what's interesting is this isn't just like dry legal stuff. This chapter kind of reveals a debate among conservatives themselves about how to, handle these massive companies in our digital world, the 21st century.
Right, right. Okay, so before we get too deep into it, let's do a super quick, like, level set, make sure we're all on the same page. We're talking about antitrust laws. These are basically like the referees of the business world.
Right.
Make sure that one company gets so big it just, like, squashes all the competition.
Yeah.
We've got the Sherman Act from way back 1890, and then the Clayton Act, 1914, the OGs of antitrust.
Yes, exactly. The foundation, yeah. And then you have the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. They're the ones with the whistle, like, enforcing those antitrust laws. But they also have this other power overseeing uh, unfair or deceptive practices, think misleading ads, shady deals, stuff like that.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about whether a company is like a straight-up monopoly.
Yeah,
It's about whether they're playing fair in general.
right. Now, this chapter lays out two big ideas about, like, the goal of antitrust. What should it be aiming for? One is that classic consumer welfare view. So are you the buyer getting a good deal? Do you have plenty of options to choose from?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But the chapter argues that some conservatives want a broader view.
Exactly. They're saying, hold up. These mega companies affect way more than just our wallets. They have an impact on free speech, on elections, even like how our kids grow up online. And the chapter even quotes Senator John Sherman from way back when these laws were being written. He was worried about these kings of industry having too much power. And it wasn't just about prices.
Interesting, interesting. So are they calling to go back to the like trust-busting days of the early 1900s?
Not necessarily, no. But it is a reminder to look at the bigger picture. The point is, those early antitrust laws were concerned about companies becoming so big they could, like, control politicians or shut down people who disagreed with them. Have we kind of forgotten that?
Hmm, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into some specifics now. This chapter really zeroes in on ESG, environmental, social, governance policies. A lot of companies are all about ESG these days.
Yeah, they are. And the chapter's not saying ESG is bad inherently, but they are raising some red flags. Like, are some companies using ESG as a kind of sneaky way to stifle competition?
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
Imagine, like, a bunch of companies, they all agree to only use certain suppliers, right? The sustainable ones, even if they're pricier. That could shut out smaller competitors who can't meet those fancy standards. So is that really about saving the planet, or is it more about controlling the market?
That's a really good point. And the chapter suggests a special FTC task force to look into this, right?
They do, yeah. And they even bring up Senator Hawley grilling FTC Chair Lena Khan about this whole thing. Hawley was worried that companies are using these ESG promises as a way to, like, smooth the way for mergers or avoid antitrust scrutiny. It's like, hey, look how virtuous we are. Let us merge, pretty please.
Hmm. So using ESG as like a get out of jail free card, that's a pretty bold idea.
It is. And it makes you think, could ESG be used to kind of like manipulate markets, limit your choices as a consumer, but under the guise of doing good? Adds a whole other layer to the debate, for sure.
Definitely. All right. And then there's this whole cancel culture angle.
Yeah. This is where the chapter digs into businesses, especially the ones with a ton of power, maybe even connections to the government, possibly breaking the rules when they refuse service based on political views, not religious views, but political ones.
Hold on, wait. So they're saying companies can't choose who they do business with. That seems a little, I don't know, slippery slopey.
Well, hold on. It's not quite that simple. The chapter draws a line between refusing service for political beliefs versus refusing service based on religious beliefs, right?
Yeah.
And they're specifically talking about situations where a company might be using its, like, dominance in the market in a deceptive way or unfairly.
Okay. So like a social media platform banning certain voices or a bank refusing to lend money to a whole industry because they don't like their politics.
Right. It raises these tough questions about where the line is. If a company controls a huge chunk of the market, do they have a different responsibility to the public than, a small mom and pop shop? It's a tricky balance between a company's values and, like, its power, right? What do you think?
Honestly, It's a tough one.
Mm.
But before I spiral into an existential crisis about the internet, let's talk about another big concern this chapter raises. The impact of all this on kids.
Yeah, this is huge for a lot of conservatives, for sure. The chapter brings up how kids online, they're clicking agree to these contracts they probably don't understand, and it really highlights that potential dark side of social media, the impact on young minds.
Yeah, that's something I worry about too. It feels like every day there's a new study about, screen time in kids.
Right, and some of the data is kind of alarming. For example, did you know that teen mental health took a serious nosedive right around the time social media really exploded? Now, correlation doesn't equal causation, but it's definitely something to think about.
Wow, I did not know it was that drastic.
Makes you wonder, right? And within the conservative movement itself, there's this whole debate about how to handle this. Some folks are all about parental responsibility, while others say we need more rules, more protection for kids online. It's a tough call for sure.
Okay, so we've got these giant companies, and the chapter seems to be saying we can't just ignore the problems they might be creating.
Exactly, exactly. And they make the point that those old ways of measuring, like economic harm, they might not work for companies like Google and Facebook, right? It's a different game they're playing. They're not just jacking up prices. They're collecting massive amounts of data. They're controlling what information we see.
Right, right, like that whole if you're not paying for the product, you are the product thing.
Yeah.
So are they saying we need to, like, break up big tech?
Not necessarily, no, but they are saying we can't be naive about it. They highlight the FTC's decision not to sue Google back in 2013 based on some predictions that turned out to be totally wrong.
So they let Google keep growing and growing, and
Yeah.
maybe that wasn't such a good idea in hindsight.
That's what the chapter's suggesting, yeah. They're warning that if we don't take this seriously, it's not just our wallets that could take a hit. We're talking potential harm to our democracy, to free speech, even to basic freedoms.
Whoa, okay. That's a chilly thought. It feels like we're at a crossroads here.
We are. We are. And this chapter is a call to really think about the bigger picture. How do we balance freedom and innovation in this digital age? How do we make sure the marketplace is fair for everyone, not just the giants? Those are the questions we need to grapple with.
Okay, so we've established that ignoring this problem with giant companies isn't really an option. But what should we be doing differently? What would a conservative approach to antitrust look like in this, wild west of the internet?
Well, this chapter doesn't give us a step-by-step plan, but it does point to some key ideas. First, they stress that we got to understand how these tech companies actually work. The old rules of thumb, they might not apply anymore.
Right, it's not like your grandpa's monopoly, right?
Exactly. And they really emphasize that the FTC needs to be more adaptable, more nimble. The tech landscape changes so quickly, the FTC needs to be able to keep up.
So less about clinging to old ideas and more about being ready to tackle new challenges.
Precisely. They even suggest that the FTC should pay more attention to what's happening at the state level. Attorneys general are often dealing with these issues on the ground in specific industries. Maybe they're seeing things that the FTC misses from that big picture view.
Kind of like a grassroots approach to antitrust. I kind of like that.
Exactly. The chapter suggests closer collaboration between the FTC and state AGs, maybe even a specific role within the FTC to focus on this state-level stuff.
That makes a lot of sense. Different states, different industries, different challenges. It's a much more diverse perspective.
Right. The chapter also talks about the importance of the FTC's regional offices. They argue that those offices are closer to the action, more in touch with, local concerns.
Because a one-size-fits-all approach probably isn't going to work in a country as big and diverse as the U.S., right?
That's the point. But it's worth noting that not all conservatives are on board with this whole expanding the FTC's regional presence thing.
Right.
Some worry about it being too much bureaucracy, too much government interference.
Oh, right. Yeah, that classic tension between federal power and states' rights. Makes sense. Okay, but let's shift gears a bit here and talk about the elephant in the room. Big tech. This chapter doesn't shy away from, addressing the sheer dominance of these companies.
Yeah, it's like every day there's another headline about Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple. Are they too powerful? Are they stifling innovation? It's a constant debate.
It is. It is. And this chapter really wades into that debate. On the one hand, they acknowledge the incredible innovation these companies have brought about. They've changed how we shop, how we communicate, how we get information. And for the most part, consumers seem pretty happy with their services.
I
Right,
mean,
good.
come on, who doesn't love free apps and 2-day shipping?
Right, exactly. But the chapter warns against being too easily impressed. They argue that the old ways of measuring consumer harm, things like higher prices, they might not work so well for big tech.
Because their business models are so different. It's not about jacking up the price of a widget. It's about collecting data, controlling access to information. It's a whole different game. Exactly. The chapter even suggests that these platforms might be creating a kind of negative utility for users, especially young people. In other words, they might actually be making us less happy, even if we enjoy using their services.
Hold on, so are they saying, like, Facebook is making us miserable? I mean, I know doom scrolling isn't exactly a mood booster, but
It's more nuanced than that. The chapter points to research that suggests a link between increased social media use and, declining mental well-being, especially among teenagers. And they ask, should the FTC consider that a form of consumer harm, even if it doesn't show up in traditional economic indicators?
that's a really interesting question. If something is making us unhappy, shouldn't that matter, even if it's technically free?
It does challenge our assumptions about what harm even means in the digital age. And the chapter also points out how hard it is to even study these companies, you know? Their markets change so fast, their data is often secret. It's hard to get a clear picture of what's going on.
So how do you even regulate something that's constantly changing and often hiding in the shadows? It's like trying to hit a moving target in the dark.
Exactly. And the chapter points to the risk of getting it wrong, you know? They bring up the FTC's decision not to sue Google back in 2013, which was based on predictions that turned out to be wildly off.
So they're saying we need to be careful, but we also can't afford to just sit on our hands and do nothing.
Right, exactly. The cost of doing nothing could be huge. If these companies are harming competition, stifling innovation, eroding our democracy, then inaction is going to have consequences.
So it sounds like we need a new playbook for antitrust. But what does that even look like? What's the conservative vision for antitrust in the age of these internet giants?
Well, the chapter doesn't lay out a specific plan, but it does offer some, guiding principles. First, they emphasize understanding the unique nature of these tech companies, recognizing that the old models might not fit. They also stress the need for, adaptability, being open to considering a wider range of factors beyond just price when assessing harm.
So a more holistic approach, taking into account the broader impact these companies have on society, not just the economic stuff.
Exactly. And finally, the chapter emphasizes caution. They recognize that government intervention can sometimes backfire, but at the same time, they argue that we can't just stand by and let these companies become too powerful, too entrenched, you know?
It's a delicate balance, right? Encouraging
Yes.
innovation, protecting consumers, safeguarding our democracy. It's a lot to juggle.
It is, it is. But the stakes are high. This chapter is a call for conservatives to really engage in this debate, to help shape the future of antitrust in a way that protects both economic freedom and individual liberty.
All right, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive, like a ton.
Yeah.
We talked about antitrust law's history, the challenges of, applying it to these big tech companies, the roles of the FTC, state governments, even got into the whole philosophy behind it. Like, why does this even matter? It's a lot to process.
It is. And this chapter, it doesn't pretend it's simple. It's not like, here's the answer. It's more like, here are the tough questions we got to ask. It's like, they give you this toolbox.
Yeah.
Right. But then they're like, okay, now you figure out how to use these tools in this crazy, fast-changing world.
Right, exactly. It's not just about, like, busting up some oil monopoly like in the old days.
Yeah.
This is the digital age, right?
Mhm.
Companies have so much power. It's not just money.
Mhm.
It's information, data even, like our attention.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where those guiding principles they talk about in the chapter, that's where those come in. They're saying conservatives need to kind of rethink how they view antitrust, be more flexible, think about the bigger picture, How do these companies affect society as a whole?
So it's recognizing that harm, it's not just about higher prices for stuff. It could be about free speech, having access to information, even like how are our kids' minds being affected by being online all the time?
Exactly, yeah. And they make us ask, what does protecting the consumer even mean when so much stuff online is free, but they're taking our data, shaping our behavior? It's a whole new world out there.
It really is. And they're not letting us off easy. They say doing nothing, that's not an option. If we just let things keep going the way they are, we could end up in this future where, like, 5 companies control everything, our economy, our lives, everything.
Yeah, they don't sugarcoat it. They're like, this is what could happen. Less innovation, fewer choices, even our democracy in trouble.
Whoa, okay, kind of scary, but also, like, a wake-up call.
Yeah.
This chapter is really saying, hey, conservatives, you got to get in this fight. Help shape the future here. We need antitrust that protects our wallets and our freedom.
Absolutely. And it's not just theoretical stuff, It's about real choices that'll affect every single one of us big time.
Well, I think we had a pretty good job unpacking this chapter. Took a deep dive into antitrust in the digital age. So, any final thoughts?
I think this chapter reminds us that the debate about antitrust, it's more important than ever. It's not just about economics, it's about power, about freedom, and what kind of world we want to live in.
Couldn't said it better myself. Thanks for walking us through all this. It's complex stuff. And to our listeners, thanks for sending over such a thought-provoking chapter. Catch you next time for another deep dive.